Our guest today is Professor Tim Brighouse. Tim started his working life as a teacher in a number of schools and has spent time in academia. He's perhaps best known, though, as leading Birmingham Education Authority at a time of great change and great improvement. For the last 5 years, he's been Commissioner of London Schools. Tim's not only a good talker about education, he delivers as well. Tim, welcome. Looking through your background, sort of strong academic background, went to a good university and then went straight into teaching. I've often thought about what you wanted to achieve from that. Did you see yourself as starting in teaching and eventually being a head teacher, or what? What were your ambitions in those early days?
I was influenced by an event at the age of 11, 10 actually. I went to a pretty prestigious boys' grammar school in the Midlands, and was a school phobic. And my dad lost his job and we went to live in Lowestoft, and it had a sleepy country grammar school with no press at all. But amazing interpersonal relationships, and I loved school. And so I'm sure even at that very early age, I was thinking, hey, what is the difference between schools that work well and schools that don't work well? And is it about the individual, group, or whatever? So at that stage, I was kind of lurching between being a journalist and being a teacher. And I suppose I decided, well, I'd love to be a teacher, and I might do a bit of writing as well. And that turned out to be true.
So did you want to be a head teacher?
Yeah, I did want to be a head teacher, and I only got knocked off track for being a head teacher because I thought, well, head teachers can shape schools, make them different. I was the deputy, and the guy next door said, with the school down the road, said, why don't you apply for this job in Monmouthshire, which was to be an administrative assistant looking after sites and buildings. And I said, that's just the exciting thing I'd love to do. No, seriously, it was an opportunity to shape how Monmouthshire went comprehensive. So I went and did that. I kept in touch with teaching because I always hankered after being a head teacher.
And you taught in grammar schools and secondary schools, so you'd experienced the tripartite system as a teacher.
Yeah, and I really have always wanted to be a head teacher. That's my greatest regret. And the head teachers that I work with, and there've been many, have always said to me, well, that's your problem, really.
Frustrated head teacher?
Yeah, frustrated head teacher.
Well, I'll tell you what, Tim, there's probably still one or two you could apply for if you drew
I'm too old,
to realise that ambition.
No.
Going back to the local authorities then, because it's interesting, you described that job as an education administrator. And did you actually see a local education authority at that time as an agent for change?
Yeah, I did,
local
but
authorities?
Only I took up the job in disbelief that, it could really do that. Met an extraordinary administrator leader in Monmouthshire, who was the education officer, decided I'd love to have that sort of a job. Learned a tremendous amount. You've got certain people you measure yourself against. Can I be that sort of administrator who is creative and makes a difference and gives a professional lead? And I was really lucky because I've had job opportunities that have given me that.
But over that time, which is actually 40 years, I suppose, now since you had your first local authority job, there's probably been more change in local authorities, what we ask of them, what we say about them, than during any other period. So if you go back to the 60s and 70s, what was your vision of a local education authority at that time?
I kind of never much liked the notion of power, perhaps because it brought responsibility with it. And therefore, being a person who's interested in ideas, I never kind of felt, I think it's rather at odds with your experience. I never felt that I ought to impose these ideas
we'll come to
anybody.
That later.
Yeah, okay. I mean, because I thought, well, they are either worth doing or not worth doing. So I looked at local education authorities and I didn't question what they did. But I ended up in Birmingham when the power had shifted enormously. So the power of the local education authority, which was different according to rural authorities and urban authorities. Rural authorities tend to have very strong governing bodies. Urban authorities ran the whole damn thing, micromanage the lot, because it's a challenging urban situation. By the time I got to Birmingham, it had changed in the sense that all the power of the curriculum was clearly with the government, and all the power of the kind of money spending was clearly with the school. So what were you to do in the middle?
Yeah.
Well, you could be an administrator, but if you were going to be an administrator, it would be a pretty pointless activity. And I chose to interpret that as, well, where's the gaps? Where are the opportunities to do things that central government hasn't yet thought of? And the school has got some interesting practice in it, and everybody ought to know about it. And that's the period I loved most.
I mean, I suppose to some extent you would agree that the power over the money needed to go to the schools. And that's been a good move. I suspect you're less enthralled with the idea of the power over the curriculum going to central government.
How right you are.
So what should have changed? Where should it have landed when, in the decade, I suppose, where decisions were being taken about where power lies in education?
Well, I think it's a great tragedy that at the time there was the national curriculum debate, there's a touch of the benefit of hindsight in this.
Yes.
I'm not sure. I was just against it at the time. And one of a very few number of people who was against it. And it's why I left Oxfordshire and went into the academic world. But, I mean, my view is that the national curriculum, there's a place for a national curriculum, and there's a place for an international curriculum, and there's a place for a local curriculum. And the problem with the version we had was it ignored the international, and it didn't trust the local, and therefore the national curriculum became much too weighty, much too prescriptive, and it was accompanied by a set of tests that became a straitjacket for teachers. Because I don't know what you were like, but when I taught, I kind of tried to teach really rather well, and then when exams were coming up, I'd say, okay, well, we've had an amazing time. You know, we've got really excited about this period of history. There is this boring thing coming up, this exam. We've got to get through it. So let's, for the next few months, really get ourselves through the exams. Because we've got tests at every stage, the danger is that teachers teach entirely to the test all the time.
It is, but you're right in saying there were tests. It wasn't as though there was no testing.
No.
I also remember when I was a teacher that, and I taught in a good school that was trying to do its best for children in difficult circumstances.
Urban school.
An urban school. But there were a group of youngsters at secondary level who I think missed out because there wasn't a national curriculum. So the balance of the national curriculum really was, I suppose, if you use another word, which would be an entitlement to a curriculum, it's somehow finding a balance between that entitlement and not being too prescriptive, isn't it?
Yeah, and it fell into the trap of being too prescriptive.
Yes.
So I guess that some of our problems about behaviour, which have grown in recent years, and some of our problems of attendance arose out of that very national curriculum that between 14 and 16, when kids realised they were never going to succeed by the yardstick of 5 or more A's to C's. They weren't in that territory. They didn't enjoy a watered down academic curriculum, and they became disruptive. Now, I'm overstating it, but I think that's the problem we've got, which is why I welcome the latest discussion about 14 to 19 curriculum, sets of experiences that might not be simultaneously taken, but with an outcome at 19.
Yeah,
and for my money, I'd relegate exams at 16 and go for exams at 14.
You've talked about powers being taken away from local authorities in both money and curriculum and testing. And so I suppose this notion of commissioning is making them much more on the side of the local community and buying services rather than providing them. What do you feel about that notion of local authorities as commissioners rather than providers or deliverers?
I think there's a problem with it. First of all, it isn't the first time that's happened. When I went to Birmingham, most local education authorities were being advised by a Conservative government to be securers of provisions of services, right? And to act on behalf of the individual. I chose, with colleagues there, to see a huge gap, which was how did you get a real school improvement, energising schools, and we decided to occupy that gap, which a subsequent Labour government has occupied itself. And so therefore there isn't room for the local education authority to be creative around that. I don't see, if I were simply a commissioner of local services and local education authority, I would find that a pretty arid, pointless existence. I'm sure they've got to do that, but they should be looking for the creative area. And for me, the creative area now, if I were engaged in it, would be in children's services with what are the sets of experiences that all kids should have between birth and 5, 5 and 11, 11 and 16, whether they're in home or in the community or in the school. And the only reliable institution is the school, and the school should be the body that makes sure those kids have those sets of experiences.
So children's centres, extended schools.
Yeah, all that sort of thing, including residential experiences.
Yes.
You remember the guarantee in Birmingham?
Indeed.
I mean, that was a modest first step, but we should be ensuring that what you and I would want for our own children, the state should enable all children to have.
Just onto urban education, because you've not always taught in urban areas,
No.
but I suppose you have done latterly, and that's the area in which you're best known, and it's certainly the biggest challenge I think we still face as an education service. How would you define the scale of the challenge and the nature of the challenge that faces us in our urban cities?
It's twofold. I think in the major conurbations like Birmingham, London, Manchester, whatever, you've got a set of circumstances that combines poverty and wealth. So there's kind of this tantalising, elusive promise that if you connect the wealth to the poverty, these kids that are in great poverty could have a set of enriching experiences. If you were talking about the outskirts of, and I hope people in Peterborough will forgive me, but on the edge of Peterborough, you've got a lot of poverty, but you haven't got signal huge wealth of provision in the centre of Peterborough, though I know it's a super place.
Right.
So I think there are two different sorts. I've been interested in the largest conurbations because, in a sense, I can see the huge promise of doing something in there. Partly because those conurbations attract people at the leading edge of their professions, and therefore they're attracted there. If you could get teachers to want to go there, and young teachers, they've got a sense of mission, a sense of vocation. They want to change the world. They want to crack the cycle of disadvantage, and we want teachers like that with the skill to do it in our urban schools. And I simply saw my involvement in Birmingham in particular, but earlier in the ILEA, and okay, I'd spent a lot of my career in rural, more affluent areas as well, was how do you ensure that you steal the market in teachers who believe in the transformability of kids? And so therefore, I think the role that I've had to perform is to go around telling stories that are about good practice now, about the sort of principles, getting rid of that notion of what more can you expect from kids from backgrounds like that. Spotting when people talk about these children. Never forgotten the head who said to me, but look at these children. I said to him, well, they're the only ones I've got for you.
Yes.
There aren't any others. So that they really believe in it. That's what you need in urban schooling.
That comment you've just made about the teacher said, look at these kids. And I have to say, I think we both agree that education has made rapid strides in the last decade about having higher expectations. But it's something I've changed my mind on, I think, a little bit over 10 years. That, I mean, I suppose there's two arguments. One, the one that you've just summarised, which is, look, those are the ones you've got. Your job is to get them to the highest possible standards. Don't make excuses, get on with it. There's the other, which I call the Hattersley argument, is that that's not possible unless you get the social mix in the school to begin with. And I still can be very undecided about that. So, you know, in Birmingham, in London, how difficult is it for those schools that don't attract the social mix?
It's hugely difficult, and of course they need almost every one of their staff to be exceptional, to have the belief that all kids can succeed and have amazing skills as teachers. And hence, in London, I've tried to promote a debate about chartered London teachers. You know, the notion of an urban pedagogy that is same as other pedagogies, but they know more, they've got more skills. Of course, I could take you to 50 schools in London, secondary schools, I'm thinking of, primaries as well, where if you've got a leader and if you've got a bigger critical mass of teachers who believe and have got the skill and act together and sing from the same song sheet, then I think anything's possible with vastly more numbers of kids who are in challenging circumstances than would be the case if they weren't there. It isn't that I disagree with Hattersley in the sense that if the social mix and if the external environment is more favourable, the task of the teacher is easier, but it isn't that you can't do it if it's not there. And the evidence for that, you know, is in the data. You look at schools in the most disadvantaged circumstances, they do better for kids in poverty than they do in areas. So that in a curious sense, where you've got the mix, it's easy for the school.
You get your results without having to... And I know, because we were in Birmingham at the same time, that when you went to Birmingham, and it's difficult to overstate how dire the education system was at that time, way back in 93, 94. So looking at that, if you do really want to bring about change in our urban areas, is it really crucial that the politics is lined up at the same time? And how difficult is it for people who are essentially educationalists to manage that, perceive it, know if the politics is in line with the education? I suppose what I'm saying is, can education succeed if local politics is poor?
I think it's really difficult if local politics is poor. And I wouldn't know if it was possible. It's a bit like the other question about can schools succeed if
Yes.
the social mix isn't there. I guess you can. But in Birmingham, I was dead lucky. I mean, the politics was lined up. They wanted to take education seriously. They'd never taken it seriously. In fact, the perception of Birmingham was worse than the reality. So that there wasn't a shortage of head teachers and teachers who really believed in the transformability of kids. All they needed to do was to have stories told about it and a few key indicators of, let's set targets for ever higher standards. Let's have an understanding of school improvement.
This perception thing's interesting. I remember in Birmingham, if we were to look at some of the most improved schools in Birmingham on the data, I think we'd find some of the inner city schools are the most improved schools, and that means we know that they've got exceptional school leaders and a bunch of exceptional teachers. The truth is that the middle classes from Solihull, from the Outer Ring, are still not choosing to send their children there.
I know.
And
Why?
will we ever get over that?
Well, some do. My kids went to a school on the edge of, next to the Cowley Works, which was seen as balmy. My decision. I mean, they got on perfectly well. So some people do, and there's no doubt that people who run those schools always hope that they can persuade the upwardly mobile and the articulate middle class to go to those schools. And they sometimes think that government policy is scarcely calculated to help them. I don't think we're ever going to completely overcome it, because my view is that there's double standards at work in people's thinking. They're kind of perfectly happy for their kids to be brought up with everybody during childhood, but during adolescence, when they don't know what, they're no longer children, they don't know what adult they're going to become, they do not want their kids to be put at undue risk. And the articulate middle class, I'm afraid, I get into terrible trouble for saying it, and I probably shall now, but they do not want their kids to be brought up with the children of certainly the undeserving poor.
Yeah.
And therefore, there will always be this issue.
Yeah.
For my money, that's a challenge to the system. We should be thinking of groups of schools, collective, not supremo leadership, but loose leadership. We should be seeing some change in admission arrangements and some change in funding, so that those schools automatically get better resources.
Well, Birmingham has got its poverty concentrated in the inner city with a degree of poverty on the outer ring, but one of the features of London is you've got this juxtaposition of great wealth and great poverty in neighbouring streets. So I think that is an issue in London, sort of middle class white flight, middle class buying, parental education is huge. And I'm never quite so sure, and maybe they're not as well, but if the academies are a mechanism for keeping the working class children from challenging backgrounds they had, but because of geography, find it easier to attract the middle classes, that has to be good, doesn't it?
If they do that, that would have to be good. Islington Green, when Margaret Maiden was the head of it, did exactly that. Once that school became overwhelmed or very popular with the local community, it forced the middle class out, and then they went through the cycle and had to repeat it. I think in London, that problem might temporarily be helped by the academies, but there are two dangers. It would be unfair of me not to mention them. One is that they merely pass on the problem to a nearby school.
Yes.
That's one. The second is that because nobody has done any overall planning, we're going to have the most amazing waste of existing schools as they wither on the vine because there's too much provision locally. So I think London's of its kind, different from anywhere else. And I think the London Challenge has been a great success. It's been a great success against the odds. And if I said there was one thing that I don't think it's been as good as it should have been at, and that is planning the provision.
And it was great news recently when the Ofsted report came out and it said that London schools had improved, and the statistics and the data are there to show that the work that's gone on in the last 5 years is really coming to it. I bet if you and I went out now and stopped 10 people on the London streets, we wouldn't get that. We wouldn't actually have people saying to us, London schools are better, the perception's not changed. If I look at Birmingham, I think the perception of the city about its own schools changed
Yeah.
as the schools improved. And that's not happening as much in London. Partly, I think maybe it's the media.
It is the media.
Or what? But is that right, that perception is lagging behind reality? And who causes it, and is it a problem?
It is a media issue. And in Birmingham, it was dead easy because I knew everybody there, and
Yes.
I could kind of work on the media. And the media got the message. And
They became part of the
and they
crusade to
became
raise
part
standards.
of that amazing campaign to raise standards and took pride in it. And they were all on side. All right, they had to deal with the odd crisis, but they really were excited about what could be done. There is no sense of the London press, particularly the Standard, catching that, though their coverage more recently has been a lot better. And I agree, there is nowhere near the strength of perception about London as there is in Birmingham. And, you know, there is one other factor, which I think we should be honest with each other about, that if you have a market in schooling, and we have got a market in schooling, it's inevitable that with published league tables, etc., there are going to be schools at the bottom. I think that the moment we moved into markets in schooling is the moment that the media, coupled with politicians and the need to fight for political space, means that education, along with some others provisions like the health service, are going to be always perceived to be more failing than they are succeeding. Because people on the whole don't think that news is made out of success, it's made out of failure.
I mean, that's been one of your features really, Tim, that you've always been seen someone as half full rather than half empty. And although I know you've been very demanding of your schools and of the teachers, I think if I stopped 10 teachers in Birmingham, they would all say you thought they were doing a good job. Public praise, quiet criticism, I think that would probably sum it up. That became much more difficult for us in government to look at what you did locally in Birmingham, in terms of setting targets, having entitlements, trying to praise teachers. What's the differences at flux there that make it a challenge for them?
Well, I think there are loads of points to make, but the one is that I think if I were critical within the constraints of what you've had to deal with, it would be that you've gone for single-shot solutions. So if there had been 3 literacy hours, not 1, and schools had to choose between different forms of approach, and you judged by the outcome, I think you would have unlocked more intellectual potential and people would have owned it more. So you wouldn't have got as much criticism because they'd still have to choose one of the 3 and get on with it. That's number one. The second thing is I think there is an interaction between the media and politicians, which at a national level is wholly unhelpful because I think that...
And very different than that at local level.
Yeah, and their problem is that they want to make sure that they're in the centre ground and they're appealing to everybody. Whereas when you're at a local level, you can be unambiguous that I always had in my mind, the teachers are listening to this, the parents are listening to this, and I must remember to say something nice about the City Council because they're the ones who've made all this happen. I don't believe that is true at a national level. There isn't the same ownership, and it's to do with remoteness. It's to do with identity. There was a real identity around Birmingham. If you're working on a forward-looking organisation, your bottom line is relationships. You're working at possibilities. You're providing opportunities. You're getting action and results. Think of our Parliament, stuck in a building that's many centuries years old, interacting with the media, always having to be right, to look good, never daring to admit error. You're in an organisation that is at odds with the school, which should be around relationships, etc., etc. So I think there's always a tension, so long as we realise it's there.
Have local authorities been left with enough power to continue to make that work at local level?
In my view, no. No, I don't think that. I think that the oddly enough, I've never been one to take governing bodies too seriously, but they are an accountable body, and I think the model of change that is coming in through academies and trust schools, in the end, will ill serve us all, because there is no sense of that governing body being accountable. There was a thread to the local community. There should be. It wouldn't take much of an amendment to the legislation to do it. But if you don't do that, there will never be the interdependence and cooperation, and there will be signal examples of corruption and failure, which there needn't be, because the more independent people are, the more dangerous it is when things go wrong.
I think I might find myself agreeing with you on that, Tim.
You can do now.
I'm free to do so. Just, I think finally, what's your judgment of the last decade and what it's meant for schools in this country?
My judgment of the last decade is that we take education much more seriously than we've ever done in the past. The investment is without parallel in my working lifetime. The priority of birth to 5 will have a payoff 10 years from now, not now. The focus on school improvement has enabled more schools to improve. The standard of teachers coming in is higher than it ever has been. We know more about teaching and learning than we've ever known. There's a hell of a lot still to be done, like cracking the cycle of disadvantage in those areas which we've been talking about across the board. But it's never been better. In a sense, those starting out now are genuinely standing on the shoulders of giants. And I don't think they'll bugger it up, you forgive the expression. I think they've got the skill, the energy, the commitment to take things on. So that in 20 years' time, people will be looking back on what we've done and saying, did they really, really think that they were making much progress? I think their progress in the future will be fantastic. But it's been the kind of catalyst the last 10 years, the catalyst for change, and change for the better.
And so the result on schools is that they're improved?
Improved all the time, improving. Of course, there are individuals that are going up and down, but overall, it's incontestable. The whole thing's moving forward really rather well.
Tim, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.